3,000 years ago, a woman stood at the center of the world's most powerful empire and reshaped its religion, its politics, and its future. Her image survived. Her name did not. Her face traveled through centuries while her authority was buried beneath broken monuments and rewritten records. She ruled beside a god-king, dismantled ancient priesthoods, built a city from desert sand, commanded administrators and generals, and claimed symbols reserved only for kings. Then, without trial or proclamation, she vanished from official history. No tomb, no grave, no final inscription, only fragments, only silence, only questions. This is the story of how Egypt's most powerful woman rose, ruled, disappeared, and refused to be forgotten. Before her name was erased from stone, before her memory was buried beneath centuries of silence, before her story was broken into fragments and scattered across ruined temples, there was a woman whose presence once dominated the greatest empire on earth. A woman whose face would become immortal. A woman whose power would terrify generations. A woman history tried to destroy. Her name was Nefertiti. Today, millions recognize her face. The elegant neck, the calm, confident gaze, the tall blue crown, the perfect symmetry carved in limestone more than 3,000 years ago. Her bust sits behind glass in a Berlin museum, admired as one of the greatest artworks in human history. But that statue tells only a fraction of the truth. It shows her beauty. It does not show her power. It does not reveal her ambition. It does not explain why her enemies tried so desperately to erase her. To understand Nefertiti, we must travel back to a time when Egypt ruled the known world. Around 1370 BCE, Egypt was not merely a kingdom. It was an empire. Its armies marched across Nubia and the Levant. Its gold filled foreign treasuries. Its ships crossed seas. Its diplomats shaped international politics. Its monuments dwarfed anything built elsewhere. From the cataracts of the Nile in the south to the plains of Syria in the north, Egypt's authority was unquestioned. At its center stood the pharaoh, not just a king, a living god, the embodiment of divine order, the guardian of the universe itself. Egyptians believed the cosmos depended on their ruler. If the pharaoh performed rituals correctly, the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, crops would grow, and chaos would be kept at bay. This sacred balance was called Ma'at. Truth, justice, harmony, order. Without Ma'at, the world would collapse, and the pharaoh was responsible for maintaining it. At this time, the throne was occupied by Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's greatest rulers. His reign was peaceful, wealthy, and magnificent. He built colossal temples. He commissioned massive statues. He married foreign princesses. He maintained diplomatic ties with Babylon, Mitanni, and the Hittites. Under him, Egypt reached the height of luxury. Gold flowed like water. The priesthood grew rich. The royal court became dazzling. And into this golden age, a girl was born. Her name meant, "The beautiful one has come." Nefertiti. We do not know her exact birthplace. We do not know her exact parents. And that mystery is important. In ancient Egypt, lineage mattered. Royal families carefully recorded their bloodlines. Ancestry was proof of legitimacy. Power was inherited through genealogy. Yet Nefertiti's origins are unclear. Most scholars believe she came from a powerful noble family, possibly from the city of Akhmim. Many think her father was a high-ranking court official who would later become Pharaoh himself. If this is true, Nefertiti grew up close to power, close to politics, close to intrigue, close to ambition. She was not a peasant girl raised by chance. She was raised for greatness. From childhood, Nefertiti received an elite education. She learned to read and write hieroglyphs. She studied religious texts. She memorized royal protocols. She learned court etiquette. She understood politics. Elite Egyptian women were not powerless. They could own land. They could run businesses. They could influence policy. They could manage estates. And Nefertiti mastered these privileges. But she went further. She studied power itself. She watched how priests manipulated belief. She observed how officials controlled resources. She learned how kings balanced fear and loyalty. She was not satisfied with ceremonial status. She wanted influence. She wanted authority. She wanted control. By her early teens, Nefertiti caught the attention of a young prince. Amenhotep, the second son of the pharaoh, not originally meant to rule. His older brother had been the heir, but fate intervened. The elder prince died young, and suddenly Amenhotep became Egypt's future. He was intelligent, sensitive, unconventional, different. Unlike most princes trained for war and tradition, Amenhotep was deeply religious, introspective, and questioning. He was fascinated by theology. He wondered about the nature of divinity. He questioned old rituals. And when he met Nefertiti, something extraordinary happened. They recognized each other. Two ambitious minds. Two unconventional spirits. Two people dissatisfied with tradition. Their marriage was likely arranged. But evidence suggests it became something more. A partnership. Around 1353 BCE, Amenhotep III died. His son ascended the throne. He became Amenhotep IV, and beside him stood Nefertiti, barely 15 years old, now Queen of Egypt, the most powerful woman in the world. But she did not intend to be silent. From the very beginning, Nefertiti was visible, unusually visible. She appeared in religious ceremonies. She appeared in state rituals. She appeared in official inscriptions. She appeared beside the king constantly. Previous queens had been respected, but they were secondary. Nefertiti was different. She stood beside the pharaoh as an equal. She spoke. She acted. She ruled. And soon, Egypt would change forever. To understand what was coming, we must understand what they were about to challenge. Egyptian religion was ancient, thousands of years old. It worshipped hundreds of gods. Ammonius, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, Hathor. Each city had its deity. Each profession had protectors. Each ritual had tradition. At the top stood Ammonius Ra. His priesthood was enormously powerful. They owned land. They collected taxes. They controlled labor. They influenced politics. In many ways, they rivaled the pharaoh himself. And they were conservative. They hated change. They feared reform. They protected tradition. Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti saw this system, and they hated it. The young royal couple believed Egypt had become corrupted. That priests had grown too rich. That religion had become political. That gods had become tools. They wanted something radical, something dangerous, something revolutionary. They wanted one God, one truth, one authority, centered on themselves. And Nefertiti was fully committed to this vision. She was not following her husband. She was leading with him. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV made a shocking declaration. There is only one true God, the Aten, the sun disk, not Ammonius, not Ra, not Osiris, not Isis, only Aten. This was heresy, blasphemy, revolution, and Nefertiti stood beside him, supporting it, promoting it, enforcing it. She became the face of a new faith. Soon, Amenhotep changed his name. He became Akhenaten, servant of the Aten, and Egypt entered its most radical period. Temples were closed. Priests were stripped of power. Old gods were abandoned. A new capital was built in the desert. Akhenaten, modern Amarna, and Nefertiti was everywhere. On walls, on altars, on monuments, on reliefs. She was no longer just queen. She was divine. By the end of this chapter, one truth is clear. Nefertiti was not a passive figure in history. She was not decoration. She was not an accessory. She was a revolutionary, a strategist, a ruler in training, a woman preparing to claim power no Egyptian woman had ever held before. And this was only the beginning. In the next chapter, we will see how Nefertiti transformed from queen to co-ruler, how she reshaped religion, and how she began her ascent toward absolute authority. Because soon, she would no longer stand beside a god. She would become one. When Egypt looked upon its young royal couple in the early years of Amenhotep IV's reign, it saw something it had never seen before. Not just a king, not just a queen, but a partnership, a union of power, belief, and ambition so tightly bound that it would reshape an empire. At its center stood Nefertiti and her husband, Akhenaten. Together, they were about to challenge 3,000 years of tradition. In traditional Egypt, queens were important but limited. They were great royal wives. They were priestesses. They were mothers of heirs. They were symbols of fertility and continuity. They were not rulers. They did not issue commands. They did not dominate religious life. They did not redefine theology. They did not stand as equals to kings. But Nefertiti refused to accept this role. From the earliest inscriptions of the reign, her presence is overwhelming. She appears beside the king in temple reliefs. She participates in sacred rituals. She receives divine blessings. She offers sacrifices directly to the gods. Not behind him, beside him. In Egyptian art, size meant status. Servants were small. Officials were medium. Kings were massive. And queens were always smaller than kings. Except Nefertiti. She is the same size as her husband. This was not accidental. This was political. This was revolutionary. It was a visual declaration that she was his equal. Behind palace walls, their relationship was even more unusual. Ancient Egyptian royal marriages were often cold and strategic. Pharaohs took multiple wives. Love was secondary to lineage. Queens were replaceable. But the evidence from Amarna tells a different story. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were inseparable. They appear together constantly. They touch in public scenes. They embrace. They kiss. They laugh. They hold hands. This was unheard of. Never before had a pharaoh allowed such intimacy to be recorded in stone. These were not private moments. They were propaganda. They were telling Egypt, we rule together. We believe together. We are chosen together. This partnership was not just emotional. It was ideological. Both believed Egypt's religion had become corrupted. For centuries, priests had grown richer than kings. The cult of Ammonius controlled land, labor, and wealth. Temples functioned like corporations. Priests decided what was divine, and pharaohs increasingly depended on them. Akhenaten despised this. So did Nefertiti. They saw religion as a tool of control, and they wanted to reclaim it. For themselves, their solution was radical. They focused on a single divine force, the Aten, the visible sun disk. Not a statue, not a myth, not a hidden god, a physical presence. Light, heat, life. To them, Aten was universal. It touched everyone. It needed no intermediaries. Except one, them. In this new theology, the Aten did not speak to priests. It did not speak to common people. It spoke only to the royal couple. The sun's rays were shown ending in tiny hands. Those hands touched only Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They received life directly. They transmitted it to Egypt. This made them indispensable. Without them, there was no connection to God. Without them, Ma'at collapsed. Without them, chaos returned. This was brilliant. They had eliminated the priesthood. They had replaced hundreds of gods. With themselves, Nefertiti's role in this system was essential. She was not symbolic. She was theological. In inscriptions, she is described as Great of Favor, Mistress of Joy, Lady of Grace, she who pacifies the Aten. She was presented as the emotional and spiritual balance to her husband. Akhenaten embodied solar authority. Nefertiti embodied harmony. Together, they represented cosmic completeness, male and female, light and balance, power and beauty. This duality was central to their ideology. Without Nefertiti, the system failed. Soon, the old gods began to disappear. Ammonius' name was erased from monuments. His temples were closed. His priests were dismissed. His wealth was confiscated. Statues were destroyed. Rituals were banned. Traditional festivals were canceled. For ordinary Egyptians, this was terrifying. Their ancestors had worshipped these gods for millennia. Now they were forbidden, and in their place stood only the royal couple. Resistance grew quietly. Priests resented losing power. Officials feared instability. Generals worried about foreign threats. Merchants worried about trade. But open opposition was impossible. The king was a god. The queen was divine. Questioning them meant questioning the universe. So people obeyed. Outwardly, as opposition simmered, Nefertiti became more assertive. She took on new titles. She led ceremonies alone. She issued proclamations. She supervised construction. She appeared without her husband in sacred contexts. This was extraordinary. It suggested independent authority. She was no longer just sharing power. She was accumulating it. Around this time, the couple made their most dramatic move. They abandoned Thebes, the ancient religious capital, the heart of Ammonius worship, the base of priestly power. They left it behind and built a new city in the desert, Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today, Amarna, this city was created from nothing. No old temples, no old priests, no old traditions, only their vision, and Nefertiti helped design it. Amarna was unlike any Egyptian city. Temples had no roofs. Sunlight flooded everything. Palaces were open and airy. Walls were covered in intimate scenes. It was a city built for ideology, for spectacle, for control. And Nefertiti was its queen. In this new capital, her dominance became undeniable. She presided over courts. She received foreign envoys. She rewarded officials. She punished rivals. She oversaw rituals. She was everywhere, and people noticed. Foreign kings began addressing her directly. Officials prayed to her. Artists depicted her like a god. She was becoming more than a queen. She was becoming an institution. At the same time, she gave birth to 6 daughters. No sons. In traditional Egypt, this was dangerous. No male heir meant instability. Rival claimants could emerge. Civil war was possible. Yet Nefertiti remained secure. Why? Because power was no longer based on blood alone. It was based on divine connection, and she controlled that. By the middle of Akhenaten's reign, Egypt had changed completely. Old religion was gone. New theology ruled. New capital flourished. New hierarchy existed. And at the top sat 2 figures. Not one, 2. King and queen. Prophet and priestess. Sun and balance. Akhenaten and Nefertiti. But beneath this appearance of harmony, cracks were forming. The empire was weakening. Vassal states rebelled. Borders were threatened. Trade routes faltered. The army felt neglected. Rome was not yet Egypt's enemy, but Persia was rising, and Egypt was distracted, consumed by ideology. And Nefertiti saw this. She understood that belief alone could not protect an empire. Power required force, strategy, control, and she was preparing, quietly, carefully, for the next stage of her rise. Because soon, she would no longer be content to share power. She would seek to hold it alone. In the next chapter, we will see how Nefertiti transformed from divine partner to political commander, how she entered military and diplomatic affairs, and how she began her journey toward becoming Pharaoh herself. The queen was becoming something far more dangerous, a ruler. By the time the city of Akhenaten stood complete beneath the blazing Egyptian sun, something had fundamentally changed in the balance of power within the empire. Outwardly, Egypt was ruled by a visionary king and his radiant queen. But beneath the rituals, the monuments, and the sacred language of the Aten, a quieter transformation was taking place. Authority was shifting, and at the center of that shift stood Nefertiti. In the early years of the reign, Nefertiti had ruled beside her husband, Akhenaten, as a sacred partner. She was visible. She was influential. She was revered. But now, she was becoming indispensable. Akhenaten was increasingly absorbed by religion. He spent hours composing hymns to the Aten. He supervised temple rituals. He debated theology with priests. He commissioned religious art. His mind was focused on heaven. Nefertiti's was focused on earth. Running an empire was not a spiritual exercise. It required constant attention. Taxes had to be collected. Soldiers had to be paid. Borders had to be defended. Trade had to be protected. Officials had to be supervised. And while Akhenaten retreated deeper into his religious vision, Nefertiti stepped forward to manage reality. She began presiding over administrative councils. She reviewed petitions from governors. She supervised construction projects. She approved appointments. She monitored grain supplies. She resolved legal disputes. These were not ceremonial tasks. They were the machinery of power. Evidence from Amarna's archives reveals her growing role. Officials addressed her directly. They sought her favor. They appealed to her judgment. They praised her wisdom. In tomb inscriptions, nobles thanked her for promotions and land grants. Not the king. Her. This was unprecedented. It meant that careers depended on her. Wealth depended on her. Survival depended on her. In Egyptian politics, this kind of dependence created loyalty, and loyalty created authority. Nefertiti was building her own network, a parallel power structure, one that did not rely entirely on her husband. At the same time, her public image was changing. Early in the reign, she appeared primarily as a religious figure. Now, she was being portrayed as a ruler. She sat on thrones. She wore royal crowns. She held symbols of authority. She appeared alone in official scenes. She received offerings independently. In some reliefs, Akhenaten is absent. Only Nefertiti remains, receiving divine blessing, issuing commands, dispensing justice. This was a silent revolution. Most striking were the military images. On temple walls, Nefertiti was shown, driving a chariot, leading processions, wielding weapons, striking enemies. One relief depicts her raising a mace above bound captives. This was the most sacred symbol of kingship, the smiting scene. For thousands of years, only pharaohs were shown this way. Never queens, never women, never consorts. But there she was, performing the ultimate act of royal dominance, declaring herself protector of Egypt. These images were not artistic accidents. Every detail in Egyptian art was deliberate, approved, controlled, ideological. By allowing these depictions, Nefertiti was making a statement. I'm not secondary. I am not symbolic. I'm not temporary. I rule. Foreign diplomats noticed. Envoys from Syria, Nubia, and Mesopotamia recorded her presence in official ceremonies. They bowed to her. They presented gifts to her. They negotiated in her presence. Some addressed letters to her. In ancient diplomacy, this was extraordinary. Foreign kings dealt with rulers, not wives, not companions, not ceremonial figures. Rulers. Behind closed doors, Nefertiti's influence grew even stronger. Akhenaten trusted her completely. She controlled access to him. She filtered information. She shaped decisions. She managed a schedule. She decided who could speak to the king. In royal courts, this kind of gatekeeping was power itself. If you controlled access to the ruler, you controlled the state. And Nefertiti controlled access. Meanwhile, Egypt's external situation was deteriorating. Vassal states in Syria were rebelling. Local kings ignored imperial orders. Enemies pressed borders. Trade routes became unstable. The famous Amarna letters revealed desperate pleas from governors asking for military support. Send troops. We are under attack. We are losing territory. Your servants are being killed. Many of these letters went unanswered. Akhenaten was focused on religion. Nefertiti was forced to deal with consequences. She met with generals. She coordinated responses. She approved troop movements. She managed defenses. She negotiated with regional leaders. Though official records rarely describe her issuing military orders directly, the symbolism is clear. She was involved. She was informed. She was deciding. The queen was becoming a commander. At the same time, succession was becoming a serious concern. Nefertiti had given birth to 6 daughters. No sons. No obvious male heir. In traditional Egypt, this was dangerous. It invited conspiracies. It encouraged rivals. It destabilized dynasties. But instead of weakening her position, this strengthened it. Why? Because she was redefining legitimacy. Power no longer flowed only through male blood. It flowed through divine connection. And she controlled that connection. She began emphasizing her sacred role. She was presented as the living image of the Aten, the one who gives life, the mistress of all lands. These were not decorative titles. They were political weapons. They placed her above traditional gender boundaries, above conventional hierarchy, above challengers. Around the 12th year of the reign, a grand celebration was held at Amarna, a massive international gathering. Foreign rulers sent representatives. Tribute poured in. Gold, silver, precious stones, exotic animals, luxury goods. It was a display of imperial dominance. And at the center of it all sat Nefertiti. Not behind the king, beside him, on an equal throne, receiving tribute, approving gifts, presiding over ceremonies. This was the moment when her status became undeniable. She was co-ruler, in practice, if not yet in name. But power creates enemies. Priests hated her. Traditional elites resented her. Military leaders distrusted her. Old families feared her. They saw a woman dismantling systems that had favored them for centuries. They watched her concentrate authority. They watched her bypass institutions. They watched her reshape ideology. And they waited. Inside the palace, tensions also grew. Akhenaten's health may have been declining. Some scholars believe he suffered from chronic illness. Others think he became increasingly isolated, obsessed, withdrawn, detached. Whatever the cause, his active governance decreased. And as he retreated, Nefertiti advanced. She began using new names, new titles, new royal formulas. Some inscriptions place her name inside cartouches, an honor reserved for pharaohs. This was revolutionary. It suggested sovereign status. Not consort, not deputy, sovereign. By the later years of the reign, Egypt was effectively ruled by two centers, the spiritual king and the political queen. Akhenaten ruled heaven. Nefertiti ruled earth. But this balance could not last forever. Empires do not tolerate dual authority. Sooner or later, one figure dominates. And Nefertiti was preparing for that moment. She was building legitimacy, securing loyalty, consolidating networks, establishing precedent, training administrators, positioning herself for something unprecedented, for something forbidden, for something dangerous, for the throne itself. In the next chapter, we will follow how Nefertiti crossed the final boundary, how she moved from influence to sovereignty, how she adopted royal identities, and how she began her transformation from queen to pharaoh. The woman behind the throne was preparing to sit upon it. By the later years of Akhenaten's reign, Egypt was living in two realities at once. On the surface, the Aten still shone over temples and palaces. Rituals continued. Hymns were sung. Offerings were made. The royal family appeared in public ceremonies, bathed in divine light. But beneath that glowing image, the empire was unstable. Borders were weakening. Governors were restless. Priests were bitter. The army was uneasy. The people were confused. And at the center of this fragile system stood one woman, quietly preparing for absolute power. Nefertiti. For centuries, Egypt had been ruled by men who claimed divine masculinity. The pharaoh was Horus incarnate, the son of Osiris, the divine father of the nation, the fertilizing force of the Nile. Kingship was imagined as male by definition. A woman could influence it. A woman could support it. A woman could protect it. But a woman could not embody it. At least, that was the ideology. Nefertiti intended to break it. Her first step was subtle. She did not announce herself as pharaoh. She reshaped perception. She began appearing in increasingly royal forms. She wore the blue war crown. She adopted the double plumes of sovereignty. She carried the crook and flail. She sat beneath royal canopies. These were not decorative accessories. They were symbols of kingship. Anyone who saw them understood the message. She was claiming space reserved for rulers. At the same time, her name changed. Earlier in the reign, she had been Nefertiti, great royal wife. Now, new forms appeared. Nefertiti and Nefertiti. Beautiful are the beauties of the Aten. This was not a poetic title. It was a throne name, the kind used by pharaohs. It linked her directly to divine authority. It placed her within the sacred lineage of kings. And in some inscriptions, this name appeared alone, without reference to Akhenaten. This was unprecedented. More significant still, her name began to appear inside cartouches, the oval frames that surrounded royal names. Only pharaohs were allowed this honor. Not queens, not princes, not officials. Pharaohs. By placing her name in cartouches, official scribes were declaring something radical. She was sovereign. These changes did not happen overnight. They appeared gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. A new inscription here, a modified relief there, a revised titulary in another place. Each step was small, but together they formed a revolution. Inside the palace, Nefertiti's authority became formalized. She presided over high courts. She issued decrees. She confirmed appointments. She commanded treasuries. She supervised temples. Her signature, figuratively and sometimes literally, appeared everywhere. Officials no longer waited for Akhenaten's approval. They went to her. She was faster, more decisive, more engaged, more present. Meanwhile, Akhenaten was withdrawing. Whether due to illness, spiritual obsession, or exhaustion, his participation in daily governance declined. He spent more time in private shrines, more time composing hymns, more time in isolation, less time with ministers, less time with generals, less time with diplomats. The vacuum was obvious, and Nefertiti filled it. By around year 12 to 14 of the reign, she was effectively co-regent, not just in practice, in ideology, in ceremony, in record. Some reliefs show 2 thrones, 2 rulers, 2 divine figures, both receiving Aten's rays, both crowned, both equal. Egypt was ruled by a dual monarchy, king and queen, male and female, light and balance. But dual monarchy was unstable. It could only exist temporarily, because when crisis came, someone would have to command alone. And crisis was approaching. The empire's outer territories were slipping away. In Syria and Canaan, Egyptian governors were being overthrown. Local warlords were rising. Hittite influence was growing. Persia was watching. Trade was weakening. Tax revenue was declining. The treasury was under pressure. Egypt could not afford indecision. It needed a strong ruler. Nefertiti understood this. She knew that if she remained merely co-ruler, rivals would challenge her after Akhenaten's death. Generals might intervene. Priests might revolt. Courtiers might conspire. A woman on a shared throne was vulnerable. A woman as sole pharaoh was dangerous, but also untouchable if she succeeded. So she took the final step. She began presenting herself as king. In some inscriptions, grammatical forms referring to her became masculine. She became his. This was not confusion. It was policy. It was the same strategy used centuries earlier by Hatshepsut. Adopt masculine language. Claim male authority. Control perception. At the same time, another name appeared in the records. Smenkhare. For decades, scholars assumed this was a male co-ruler. But evidence is fragmentary. Some texts use feminine grammar. Some associate the name with Nefertiti's titles. Some link it with Nefertiti. Many Egyptologists now believe these names may refer to the same person. Different identities, different contexts. One ruler, Nefertiti. If this is correct, then she was doing something extraordinary. She was ruling under multiple names, multiple personas, multiple symbolic roles. As queen, as co-regent, as king, as divine intermediary, as military authority, as widow-in-waiting. It was a sophisticated political strategy. It allowed her to adapt to different audiences. Priests saw a sacred figure. Generals saw a king. Foreigners saw a monarch. People saw stability. By the time Akhenaten entered his final years, Egypt was already accustomed to Nefertiti's dominance. She chaired councils. She managed crises. She represented the state. She embodied authority. Her image was everywhere. Her word was law. Her presence was unavoidable. But with power came danger. Every move she made angered someone. Priests resented her theology. Traditionalists hated her gender transgression. Generals distrusted her control. Nobles feared her reforms. Courtiers envied her influence. Enemies multiplied quietly, smiling in public, plotting in private, and she knew it, which is why she moved quickly. She secured loyalists, promoted allies, removed rivals, reorganized offices, controlled information, protected succession. She was preparing for the moment when Akhenaten would die, because when that happened, everything would be contested. Egypt would face a choice: return to tradition or accept a woman as Pharaoh, a ruler without precedent, a sovereign without apology, a queen turned king, and Nefertiti intended to win. In the next chapter, we will witness the collapse of the old order, the death of Akhenaten, and the moment when Nefertiti stood alone at the summit of power. The making of a pharaoh was complete. Now came a test. Every empire has a moment when certainty collapses, a moment when authority weakens, when rivals emerge, when loyalties are tested, when the future becomes unclear. For Egypt in the late Amarna period, that moment arrived with the slow fading of one man's life, Akhenaten, and with it came the final transformation of Nefertiti. By the final years of his reign, Akhenaten was no longer the revolutionary king who had once shaken Egypt. He was withdrawn, physically weakened, mentally distant, spiritually consumed. He spent long hours in private shrines. He rarely appeared in public ceremonies. He delegated more authority. He avoided political confrontation. Some scholars believe he suffered from chronic illness. Others suggest depression. Still others think he had become disillusioned with the world he had tried to reshape. Whatever the cause, one fact is clear. Egypt was no longer governed by him. It was governed by Nefertiti. Court officials knew it. Generals knew it. Foreign envoys knew it. Priests knew it. Anyone who wanted a decision went to her. Anyone who wanted favor sought her approval. Anyone who wanted survival pledged loyalty to her. She was no longer preparing for power. She had it. But power without legitimacy is fragile. And legitimacy in Egypt came from tradition, from divine succession, from continuity, from ritual. And Akhenaten's reign had shattered all of that. Old gods were abandoned. Old priesthoods were broken. Old customs were erased. The system that once legitimized rulers was gone, and Nefertiti had helped destroy it. Now she had to replace it. She did so by reshaping kingship itself. In the final years of the reign, inscriptions increasingly portrayed her as the primary divine intermediary. She was beloved of the Aten, she who gives life, mistress of all lands, ruler of truth. These were not titles of a widow. They were titles of a monarch. At the same time, her presence in religious scenes intensified. She appears alone before the Aten. She receives rays directly. She performs rituals without Akhenaten. She blesses officials. She consecrates buildings. She stands where only kings had stood. This was ideological preparation. Egypt was being taught to see her as ruler. Then, around 1336 BC, Akhenaten died. Quietly, without great ceremony, without grand monuments, without heroic epithets. The man who had tried to remake the universe passed away in relative isolation. And with his death, Egypt faced chaos. The throne was suddenly empty. No adult, male heir existed. No clear successor was prepared. The royal family was fragmented. The priesthood was hostile. The army was restless. Foreign enemies were watching. The empire stood on the edge of collapse. In such moments, hesitation is fatal. Nefertiti did not hesitate. Within weeks, perhaps days, new inscriptions appeared. A new royal name, Nefertiti, bearing full pharaonic titles. King of Upper and Lower Egypt, son of Ra, Lord of Crowns. These were not honorary phrases. They meant sovereignty, absolute authority, and they were attached to her. She had crossed the final boundary. She was now pharaoh, not regent, not consort, not caretaker. Pharaoh. To the public, the transition appeared smooth. Rituals continued. Officials kept their posts. Taxes were collected. Armies remained in formation. Foreign diplomacy continued. Stability was preserved. This was intentional. Chaos would have invited invasion. So she projected control. Behind the scenes, however, the court was tense. Rivals tested her. Priests whispered. Generals hesitated. Some nobles considered rebellion. A woman ruling alone was unthinkable. But she was prepared. She secured military loyalty first. Commanders were rewarded. Troops were paid. Supplies were guaranteed. Key officers were promoted. Potential rivals were reassigned. The army became hers. Next, she neutralized religious opposition. Temples loyal to Aten were strengthened. Dissident priests were sidelined. Funds were redirected. Appointments were controlled. No organized resistance formed. Then she controlled information. Royal decrees emphasized continuity. Akhenaten was honored. Aten worship continued. No rupture was acknowledged. To the public, nothing had changed. Only the ruler. Foreign kings received formal notices. Tribute demands continued. Treaties were reaffirmed. Ambassadors were reassured. Egypt was still strong. Egypt was still stable. Egypt was still dangerous. For a brief moment, her strategy worked. The empire held. The bureaucracy functioned. The borders remained quiet. The economy stabilized. The court obeyed. And in this moment, Nefertiti achieved what no woman before her had. She ruled Egypt alone. She wore the double crown. She commanded armies. She performed sacred rituals. She embodied Ma'at. She became the state. But victory created new problems. Her position was unprecedented. There was no tradition to protect her. No model to follow. No institutional support. Everything depended on her personal authority. And personal authority is fragile. Opposition did not disappear. It adapted. Traditionalists waited. Priests plotted. Generals watched. Courtiers whispered. They understood something she did too. Her reign was temporary, because the system itself opposed her. Within a few years, her name would begin to fade. Her monuments would be altered. Her decrees would be ignored. Her allies would defect. Her memory would be attacked. The counter-revolution was coming, and it would be ruthless. But for a brief, extraordinary moment, Egypt was ruled by a woman who had seized the throne of gods and kings. A queen who had become a pharaoh. A widow who had become sovereign. A revolutionary who had become tradition. And she intended to hold on. In the next chapter, we will follow how resistance grew, how old forces regrouped, and how the foundations of Nefertiti's reign began to crack. The rise was complete. Now came the fall. For a short time after the death of Akhenaten, Egypt appeared calm. Temples functioned. Officials worked. Armies remained loyal. Foreign envoys continued to arrive. Trade still moved along the Nile. To the outside world, the empire seemed stable. At its center ruled a woman who now held the full authority of kingship. Nefertiti. She had achieved what no one believed possible. But beneath that surface of order, pressure was building. Slowly, relentlessly, like cracks forming beneath a monument that still stands tall. Egypt's ruling system had been shaken for nearly 2 decades. Akhenaten's religious revolution had dismantled institutions that had existed for centuries. Priesthoods were weakened. Temples were abandoned. Economic networks were disrupted. Local elites were displaced. When Nefertiti took the throne, she inherited not a strong empire, but a fragile one. An empire held together by habit and fear, not loyalty. The first source of tension was religion. The Aten cult remained official policy. Old gods were still suppressed. Traditional rituals were still banned. But among ordinary Egyptians, resentment was growing. They whispered prayers to Ammonius in secret. They left hidden offerings to Osiris. They invoked Isis at home. Publicly, they obeyed. Privately, they resisted. Religion in Egypt was not philosophy. It was survival. People believed their lives depended on divine favor. And Nefertiti's system denied them that comfort. The priesthood, though weakened, was not destroyed. Former priests remained in society. They kept networks. They maintained influence. They waited. Every failed harvest, every illness, every military setback, they blamed on the Aten and on her. The second source of tension was the military. For years, Egypt's army had been neglected. Akhenaten had focused on theology, not defense. Fortresses were underfunded. Garrisons were understaffed. Equipment was aging. Meanwhile, rivals were strengthening. The Hittites expanded in Anatolia. Local warlords rose in Syria. Nubian tribes grew restless. Egypt's borders were vulnerable, and soldiers knew it. Many officers blamed the Amarna regime. They saw religion replacing strategy. They saw rituals replacing logistics. They saw ideology replacing discipline. They respected Nefertiti's intelligence, but they doubted her priorities. The third source of tension was the elite. Old noble families had lost influence. Positions once inherited were now assigned by loyalty. Traditional privileges had vanished. Property had been redistributed. Court politics had become unpredictable. Under Nefertiti, merit mattered more than lineage. This angered aristocrats. They felt humiliated, displaced, threatened, and they remembered. The fourth source of tension was succession. Nefertiti had no surviving sons. Her daughters had limited political authority. A young prince, Aten, existed in the background. He was weak, inexperienced, easily controlled. To many elites, he represented restoration, a return to normality, a return to harmonious, a return to tradition, and they began to position themselves around him. Nefertiti saw these dangers. She was not blind. She increased surveillance. She placed loyalists in key offices. She monitored correspondence. She rewarded supporters. She punished critics. Her rule became more centralized, more controlled, more cautious. But control has limits. An empire cannot be governed by vigilance alone. It requires belief. And belief was fading. Foreign relations also worsened. Egypt's former vassals in Canaan ignored commands. Some shifted allegiance to the Hittites. Others declared independence. Tribute declined. Trade slowed. The treasury weakened. Nefertiti tried diplomacy. She sent envoys. She offered concessions. She threatened retaliation. But her leverage was shrinking. In response, she focused on internal stability. She invested in infrastructure. She repaired canals. She supported agriculture. She stabilized grain reserves. She ensured urban supplies. She tried to prevent famine. She understood that hungry people rebel. At court, factions emerged. One group supported continuation of the Aten system. Another pushed for compromise. A third secretly favored restoration of harmonious. A fourth plotted succession. Power fragmented. Unity weakened. Perhaps most dangerous of all was isolation. As opposition grew, Nefertiti trusted fewer people. She relied on a small inner circle. She excluded former allies. She limited consultation. She became cautious, defensive, suspicious. This protected her, but also cut her off from reality. History shows that rulers often fall not because they are weak, but because they become alone. Nefertiti was becoming alone. Around this time, her public presence diminished. Fewer monuments, fewer inscriptions, fewer appearances. Some scholars believe illness played a role. Others suggest political withdrawal. Some think she was sidelined. Others think she ruled behind the scenes. The evidence is fragmentary, but something was changing. Meanwhile, powerful figures were rising. A seasoned courtier, former advisor, possible father figure. Horemheb, a military commander. Ambitious, pragmatic, traditionalist. Both men had survived every regime. Both had networks. Both had supporters. Both were waiting. They did not challenge her directly. Not yet. They watched. They gathered allies. They positioned themselves. They prepared. The restoration movement was taking shape. Quietly, carefully, in temples, in barracks, in noble houses, in private chambers, in whispers, in coded language, in secret meetings. Nefertiti sensed it, but dismantling it was difficult. Open repression would spark revolt. Compromise would signal weakness. Delay would strengthen enemies. Every option carried risk, so she chose patience. She hoped stability would return. She believed time would legitimize her reign. She trusted that success would silence critics. She underestimated her enemies. By the end of her reign, Egypt stood at a crossroads. One path led forward, a new order, a new theology, a new model of leadership. The other led backward, to tradition, to patriarchy, to priestly dominance, to familiar hierarchies. The storm was gathering, and soon it would break. In the next chapter, we will witness the collapse of Nefertiti's authority, the rise of rival powers, and the beginning of her disappearance from history. The Queen Pharaoh was about to face her greatest enemy. Not Rome, not Persia, not invasion, memory itself. History rarely records the fall of powerful women with honesty. It records their defeats. It records their enemies' victories. It records rewritten narratives. But it almost never records their voices. So when Nefertiti began to disappear from Egypt's official records, it did not happen with drama. There was no public trial, no rebellion, no execution, no declaration. There was only silence. For nearly 2 decades, Nefertiti had been everywhere. On temples, on monuments, in decrees, in reliefs, in rituals, in diplomacy. Her name filled Egypt. Then suddenly it stopped. After the later years of her rule, inscriptions no longer mentioned her. New monuments excluded her image. Official records grew vague. The woman who had ruled an empire seemed to dissolve. This disappearance is one of the greatest mysteries of ancient history, and it was deliberate. The first sign of erasure appears in royal titulary. Her throne name, Nefertiti, begins to appear less frequently. Cartouches vanish. Epithets disappear. References grow indirect. Instead of naming her, texts speak vaguely of the king. Instead of praising her, they praise order. Language is changing, and language reveals power. At the same time, new figures begin to rise. An experienced courtier, a survivor, a master of compromise. Hormheb, a general, a traditionalist, a man of the army. Both position themselves close to the young prince. Tutankhaten, the boy who would soon become king. Tutankhaten was no threat. He was young, untrained, dependent, but he was male. And in Egypt that mattered. More than talent, more than experience, more than legitimacy. Around this time, a crucial decision was made. The court abandoned Amarna, the desert capital, the symbol of Nefertiti's power, the heart of the Aten revolution. Officials returned to Memphis and Thebes. Temples reopened. Priests returned. Rituals were restored. This was a political earthquake. It meant the old order was coming back, and her order was ending. The boy king's name was changed. From Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. One letter, one god, one ideology replaced. The revolution was over. This change could not have happened without removing Nefertiti. As long as she lived and ruled, restoration was impossible. So she had to vanish. How it happened, we do not know, and that uncertainty is revealing. One theory is death. Perhaps she died of illness, plague, infection, complications. Ancient Egypt was dangerous even for royalty. But if she died naturally, where is her tomb? Where's her mummy? Where are her funerary goods? Every other major royal figure of the period has traces. She does not. That absence is suspicious. Another theory is exile. Perhaps she was forced into retirement, sent to a distant palace, confined to private life, stripped of power, allowed to live quietly. But why would her enemies risk leaving her alive? A living symbol can inspire rebellion. A dead one cannot. A third theory is assassination, poison, conspiracy, palace intrigue, silent removal. It would fit the pattern of power struggles. It would explain the sudden disappearance. But there is no physical evidence, only silence. The most compelling theory is transformation, that she did not disappear. She changed identity, that she ruled under another name. Smenkhare, Nefertiti, different titles, different gendered grammar, different roles. Same person. If true, then her disappearance was camouflage, a strategy, a way to survive. But even if she ruled briefly under another name, it did not last. The restoration movement was too strong. The army favored tradition. The priests controlled belief. The elites wanted stability. A woman pharaoh was unacceptable, so they erased her, not with one blow, but with many small ones. A name chiseled out, a relief altered, a title omitted, a monument dismantled, a record ignored, a story rewritten. Damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, the ultimate punishment in Egypt. To be forgotten, to have one's name erased, to lose immortality, to die twice, once physically, once historically. Nefertiti suffered this fate more thoroughly than almost anyone. Even Akhenaten was remembered as the heretic. She was barely remembered at all. Later king lists skipped her entirely. They pretended she never ruled. They jumped from Amenhotep III to Hormheb, as if the entire Amarna period had not existed. 2 decades erased. Her statues were smashed. Her cartouches were removed. Her temples were dismantled. Her decrees were revoked. Her followers were purged. Her ideology was outlawed. Within a generation, she had become a ghost, a rumor, a fragment, a broken inscription, a damaged relief, a forgotten ruler. Why such hatred? Because she represented danger. She proved that power was not inherently male. She showed that tradition could be broken. She demonstrated that theology could be rewritten. She ruled without apology, and that terrified the establishment. If she had been remembered, others might follow. If she had been honored, women might aspire. If she had been acknowledged, patriarchy would weaken. So she had to vanish. But erasure is never perfect. Fragments remain, in sand, in stone, in archives, in art, in memory. Centuries later, archaeologists would begin to rediscover her, piece by piece, name by name, image by image, clue by clue. They would realize that someone had been removed, that something had been hidden, that a story had been stolen. And slowly, the truth would return. When Nefertiti vanished from public life, her enemies did not celebrate openly. They did something far more dangerous. They rewrote reality. They understood that power is not secured only through armies or laws. It is secured through memory, through stories, through official records, through what future generations are allowed to know. And they were determined to control all of it. After the collapse of the Amarna regime, Egypt entered a period of quiet reconstruction. No dramatic revolutions, no violent purges, no civil war. Instead, there was restoration, a slow, methodical return to the old order, led by men who had waited patiently for their moment. At the center of this restoration stood a child, Tutankhamun. When he ascended the throne, he was barely 9 years old, too young to rule, too young to decide policy, too young to resist manipulation. He was perfect. Behind him stood two powerful figures. And Horemheb one was a master of court politics. The other was a military commander. Together, they represented the old elite. Tradition, order, patriarchy, priestly authority. They had survived every regime. Now, they would reshape history. The first step was symbolic. They changed a boy king's name. Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, became Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. One god replaced another. One ideology erased. One restored. This was not cosmetic. It was a declaration. The Aten revolution was over. Next came religion. The temples of Ammonius were reopened. Priests returned to power. Land was restored. Wealth flowed back. Rituals resumed. Festivals returned. Sacred processions filled the streets again. For ordinary Egyptians, this felt like relief. The old gods were back. The familiar world was restored. And with it, loyalty returned. But restoration required more than rituals. It required a new story, a narrative that explained why the Amarna period had happened and why it had failed. So they created one. They claimed that Egypt had fallen into chaos, that the gods had been abandoned, that temples had been neglected, that Ma'at had been broken, that disasters had followed. They blamed everything on heresy, on deviation, on rebellion against tradition, on Akhenaten, and indirectly on Nefertiti. Official inscriptions from Tutankhamun's reign describe the previous period as a time when temples lay in ruins. Gods turned away. The land was in disorder. The people suffered. Whether this was true or not did not matter. It became truth because it was written in stone. The next step was architectural. Amarna was dismantled, stone by stone, temple by temple, palace by palace. Blocks were removed, transported, reused in new buildings. Walls were smashed, reliefs were broken, inscriptions were buried. The physical evidence of her rule disappeared. This was practical and symbolic. Recycling materials saved money, but also erased memory. You cannot remember what you cannot see. Then came the most brutal step, the destruction of names. In ancient Egypt, a name was life. To erase a name was to destroy a soul. And that is exactly what they did. Nefertiti's cartouches were chiseled out. Her titles were removed. Her images were altered. Her monuments were reattributed. Sometimes her face was replaced. Sometimes it was destroyed. Sometimes it was left unfinished. But her identity was erased. Akhenaten was remembered as the heretic, as the criminal, as the rebel. He was condemned, but acknowledged. Nefertiti was worse than condemned. She was denied. King lists compiled in later centuries simply skipped her. They skipped Akhenaten's successors. They jumped from Amenhotep III to Horemheb. 2 decades vanished. An entire revolution erased. A woman pharaoh removed. Why was she targeted more thoroughly than Akhenaten? Because he could be framed as a mistake. She could not. She was a threat. Akhenaten was a strange king, an eccentric, a religious fanatic, an anomaly, easy to dismiss. Nefertiti was different. She was competent, organized, successful, strategic. She ruled effectively. She maintained order. She managed crises. She governed. And she did it as a woman. That was unforgivable. If future generations learned that a woman had ruled Egypt successfully, what would happen? Queens might demand authority. Noble women might seek power. Priestesses might claim influence. The ideology of male dominance would weaken, so her story had to disappear. I ruled briefly after Tutankhamun. Then Horemheb took the throne, and under Horemheb, the erasure became systematic. He launched a campaign of historical purification. Names removed, monuments destroyed, records altered, documents revised, archives cleansed. Nothing was left to chance. He presented himself as the true successor of Amenhotep III, skipping the Amarna period entirely, rewriting lineage, rewriting legitimacy, rewriting time itself. For centuries, his Aten did not know Nefertiti. Greek historians barely mentioned her. Roman writers ignored her. Medieval scholars had no records. She survived only as fragments, broken reliefs, damaged inscriptions, unidentified statues, mysterious cartouches. It worked. Almost. For nearly 3,000 years, she was forgotten. Her empire, her power, her reign, her transformation, her struggle, all buried beneath propaganda. History became a lie, and that lie was stable, comfortable, unquestioned, until the modern age. Because lies carved in stone still crack. Sand shifts, ruins emerge, fragments resurface, and eventually truth returns. For nearly 3,000 years, Nefertiti did not exist. Not in textbooks, not in legends, not in royal lists, not in popular memory. She had been erased so thoroughly that even scholars of ancient Egypt barely knew her name. History had been edited, and the edit had held, until the desert began to speak. In the 19th century, Europe became obsessed with ancient Egypt. Explorers, collectors, scholars, and treasure hunters flooded the Nile Valley. They mapped ruins. They copied inscriptions. They excavated tombs. They shipped artifacts to museums. It was an age of discovery and exploitation, but it reopened the past. One of the first clues came from Amarna, the abandoned city in the desert, long dismissed as an unimportant ruin. Slowly, archaeologists realized it was something extraordinary, a forgotten capital, a vanished experiment, a city without precedent. Excavations revealed palaces, temples, administrative offices, workshops, houses, and most importantly, archives, clay tablets, letters, records, the Amarna letters, correspondence between Egyptian rulers and foreign kings. These documents showed a world of diplomacy, crisis, and negotiation, and they hinted at a powerful royal woman, not always named, but unmistakably present. Scholars noticed something strange. In several letters, foreign rulers referred to the Great Queen. They sought her influence. They appealed to her authority. They treated her as a decision-maker. This did not fit the traditional picture of Egyptian queens. It suggested someone more. At the same time, inscriptions from scattered sites began to surface. Fragments bearing the name Nefertiti, cartouches, royal epithets, divine titles. But the identity behind the name was unclear. Was a man? A woman? A co-regent? A successor? No one knew. Then, in December 1912, everything changed. A German archaeological team, led by Ludwig Borchardt, was excavating at Amarna. They were working in what had once been the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose. a place where royal portraits had been created. Buried beneath rubble and sand, they found something extraordinary. A painted limestone bust, perfectly preserved, radiant, alive, a face that seemed to transcend time. A woman wearing a tall blue crown, with elegant features, calm confidence, and haunting realism. It was Nefertiti. When Borchardt first saw it, he reportedly wrote, "It is impossible to describe. One must see it." He understood instantly what he had found. Not just art, history. The bust had survived because it had been hidden, left behind when Amarna was abandoned, protected by sand, forgotten by looters, preserved by chance. Through questionable dealings, the bust was taken to Germany, hidden for years, then unveiled, and the world was stunned. Suddenly, Nefertiti had a face, a presence, an identity. She was no longer an abstract name. She was real, human, powerful, beautiful. Museums displayed her. Books featured her. Scholars studied her. Artists copied her. The public became fascinated. She became an icon, but an icon without a story. People asked, who was she? Why was she important? Why had she been forgotten? Why was her tomb missing? Why did her image feel so commanding? Egyptologists returned to the evidence. With new urgency, they re-examined inscriptions. They compared names. They analyzed grammar. They studied art. They reconstructed timelines. Slowly, a new picture emerged. They realized that Nefertiti had not been minor. She had been central. She had not been decorative. She had been dominant. She had not been passive. She had ruled. Theories multiplied. Some argued she was co-regent. Others that she was pharaoh. Some denied it. Others defended it. Debates raged in academic journals, conferences, museums, universities. One major breakthrough came from grammatical analysis. Some royal inscriptions used feminine endings with the name Nefertiti. This meant the ruler was female, not male, not symbolic, female, and ruling. Another came from burial equipment, canopic jars, funerary objects, royal vessels, originally made for Akhenaten, later modified, with her names. This suggested succession, inheritance, power. Another came from building records, quarry inscriptions, construction orders, dated to late Amarna years, naming Nefertiti, issuing commands, managing projects, exercising authority. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed. The woman erased from history had been one of Egypt's most powerful rulers. Perhaps its only true female pharaoh who ruled openly as herself. But rediscovery brought new conflict. Egypt demanded the return of the bust. Germany refused. Museums argued. Politicians intervened. Cultural debates erupted. Who owned her? Who had the right to display her? Who controlled her legacy? Nefertiti became political again, 3,000 years after her death. At the same time, popular culture transformed her. She appeared in films, advertisements, fashion, cosmetics, posters, magazines. She became a symbol of beauty, often stripped of history, reduced to aesthetics. But scholars resisted this. They insisted she was not just beautiful. She was powerful. She was dangerous. She was revolutionary. She was erased because she mattered. By the early 21st century, Nefertiti had returned to world consciousness. Not completely, not perfectly, but undeniably. Her name was spoken. Her face was known. Her story was being rebuilt. Yet one mystery remained. The greatest of all, where was her body? Where was her tomb? Where was her final resting place? Without it, her story was incomplete. And so the search continued. Through valleys, through cliffs, through hidden chambers, through radar scans, through secret doors, through political barriers, through academic rivalries. For archaeologists, finding a royal tomb is not just a discovery. It is resurrection. It means names gain bodies, stories gain voices, legends gain evidence. And in the case of Nefertiti, it would mean solving the greatest mystery of the Amarna age. Where did the most powerful woman in ancient Egypt go when she died? Every major royal figure of the 18th dynasty has a tomb. Amenhotep III, Tutankhamun, Horemheb, I, even minor princes and princesses. all accounted for, all identified, all located, except her, is as if she never died. This absence has haunted Egyptologists for over a century. Because in ancient Egypt, burial was everything. Without a tomb, there was no afterlife. Without funerary rites, the soul wandered. Without proper mummification, eternity was lost. A queen of her stature would never be denied these rituals, unless someone wanted her forgotten. The first place scholars looked was Amarna, the city she helped build, the capital of her revolution. On the cliffs east of the city lies the Royal Wadi, a valley carved for elite burials. Here stands the unfinished tomb of Akhenaten. Large, complex, damaged, vandalized. It was meant for him and his family. Some believe Nefertiti was originally intended to be buried there, but no chamber clearly belongs to her. No inscription names her. No mummy was found. If she was buried here, she was later removed. Another possibility lies in the Valley of the Kings, the royal necropolis near Thebes, the resting place of Egypt's greatest rulers. Most 18th dynasty pharaohs ended up there, even those connected to Amarna, including Tutankhamun. So why not her? For decades, scholars searched the valley. They mapped tunnels. They analyzed debris. They studied incomplete tombs. They investigated sealed doorways. They followed rumors. Nothing definitive appeared. Then, in 2015, a dramatic theory emerged. British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed something extraordinary. He argued that Nefertiti's tomb might be hidden inside Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Tutankhamun's tomb is small, unusually small for a king, more like a private burial, a hastily adapted tomb. Reeves suggested it was originally made for Nefertiti and later reused for the boy king. He noticed strange lines in the walls, irregularities, plaster seams, possible blocked doorways. Behind them, he claimed, might lie hidden chambers. And behind those chambers, Nefertiti. The idea electrified the world. News outlets exploded. Documentaries were produced. Public excitement surged. Egypt authorized investigations. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed. Scans were conducted. Early results seemed promising. Anomalies were detected. Possible voids. Possible structures. Hope soared. But later studies contradicted them. Other scans showed natural rock. No chambers. No clear spaces. No tomb. The evidence was inconclusive. Debate erupted. Reeves defended his theory. Others criticized it. The mystery deepened. Meanwhile, other researchers focused on lesser-known tombs. KV-21, KV-35, KV-55, unidentified mummies, damaged remains, anonymous burials. Some suggested Nefertiti's body might be among them. Hidden under wrong names. Misidentified. Overlooked. DNA analysis was attempted. Comparisons were made. Relationships mapped. But ancient DNA is fragile. Contamination is common. Results are uncertain. Nothing definitive emerged. Some scholars argue she was buried under another name, as Nefertiti, as Smenkhare, as a male pharaoh, which would hide her identity. Intentionally, others think she was moved, buried at Amarna, then reburied in Thebes, then disturbed, then relocated again. A chain of political cover-ups. Still others believe her tomb remains undiscovered, hidden in untouched desert, covered by sand, waiting. Egypt's landscape supports this possibility. Only a fraction of royal tombs have been found. Many valleys remain unexplored. Modern cities cover ancient sites. Political restrictions limit excavation. Time and money are limited. Searches are incomplete. The hunt is complicated by politics, tourism, national pride, international disputes, museum ownership, media pressure. Every potential discovery is scrutinized, controlled, negotiated. For Egypt, Nefertiti is more than history. She is identity, prestige, cultural capital. Finding her tomb would be global news. It would reshape tourism. It would redefine scholarship. It would shift narratives. For scholars, it would answer crucial questions. Was she buried as pharaoh, with full regalia, with masculine symbols, with feminine imagery, with Atenist iconography, or traditional gods? The tomb would reveal her final ideology, her last identity, her ultimate choice. Until then, speculation continues. Books are written, conferences held, theories proposed, careers built, debates waged, and yet the desert remains silent. Sand covers secrets. Stone guards memory. Time resists intrusion. Perhaps her tomb is waiting. Perhaps it is lost forever. Perhaps it was destroyed. Perhaps it lies beneath our feet. What is certain is this: the search for Nefertiti is not just about archaeology. It is about justice, about restoring a woman to her rightful place, about recovering stolen history, about correcting deliberate lies. 3,000 years after her enemies tried to erase her, Nefertiti achieved something no ancient ruler could have imagined. She returned, not as a pharaoh, not as a conqueror, not as a religious revolutionary, but as a global icon. Her face now travels farther in a day than her armies ever could. Her image appears in books, museums, advertisements, documentaries, classrooms, and screens across the world. She has become one of the most recognizable human faces in history. And that transformation changed everything. When her bust was unveiled in Berlin in the early 20th century, it shocked Europe. People were used to seeing ancient Egypt as rigid, distant, and symbolic. Hieratic statues, frozen expressions, formal poses. But Nefertiti looked alive, human, present. She did not look like the past. She looked like someone you might meet today. That immediacy made her irresistible. Visitors stood in silence before her. Artists sketched her. Writers described her. Photographers reproduced her. Designers imitated her. She entered popular culture. And once she did, she never left. By the mid-20th century, her image had become shorthand for beauty. Magazines called her the world's most beautiful woman. Cosmetic companies referenced her. Fashion houses borrowed her silhouette. Jewelry designers copied her crown. Her name became a brand, detached from history, detached from politics, detached from struggle. But scholars were uncomfortable. They knew this was dangerous, because turning her into an aesthetic object erased her twice. Once in antiquity, once in modernity, first as a ruler, then as a decoration. At the same time, her bust became the center of international conflict. Egypt demanded its return, again and again. They argued it had been taken through deception, through colonial inequality, through manipulation. Germany refused. They claimed it was legally acquired, that it had become part of world heritage, that it was safer in Berlin. The debate continues, and likely always will. For Egypt, she represents stolen history, a fragment of national identity held abroad, a reminder of colonial exploitation. For Germany, she represents cultural prestige, a symbol of scholarship, a major attraction. For the world, she represents shared heritage. No one agrees. Everyone cares. Meanwhile, political movements began claiming her. Feminists celebrated her as proof that women had ruled long before modern movements. Afrocentric scholars emphasized her African context. Post-colonial thinkers framed her as a victim of imperial theft. Artists reimagined her in new identities. Activists used her image in protests. She became a canvas onto which modern debates were projected. This process is called symbolic appropriation. When a historical figure becomes a mirror, people see what they want to see, not necessarily what was. Some portrayed her as a romantic heroine, others as a tragic victim, some as a feminist icon, others as a divine priestess, some as a fashion model, others as a political revolutionary. All contained fragments of truth. None contained the whole. In films and television, she was often reduced to stereotype. Beautiful, mysterious, seductive, secondary, rarely shown as a strategist, rarely as administrator, rarely as commander, rarely as ruler. The old bias returned. In modern form, even in textbooks, she was often described simply as Akhenaten's wife. A footnote, a companion, an accessory, despite overwhelming evidence of her authority. This reflects a broader problem. History struggles to represent powerful women honestly. They're either romanticized, or vilified, or simplified. rarely respected. Yet quietly, scholarship kept advancing. New excavations, new technologies, new translations, new interpretations. Gradually, her political role was reconstructed, her religious authority documented, her administrative power recognized, her reign acknowledged, her complexity restored. By the 21st century, a new image emerged. Not just Nefertiti the beauty, but Nefertiti the ruler, Nefertiti the revolutionary, Nefertiti the survivor, Nefertiti the erased, Nefertiti the returned. Museums began contextualizing her. Exhibitions highlighted her power. Documentaries explored her reign. Books analyzed her politics. Her story became deeper, richer, more honest. But tension remained. Between scholarship and spectacle. Between history and marketing. Between truth and profit. Between memory and myth. Social media intensified this. Her face became viral. Filtered, edited, recolored, reimagined, turned into memes, logos, avatars. She entered digital immortality. In this digital world, she is everywhere and nowhere, recognized, but not always understood. What is remarkable is this. Her enemies tried to erase her, and instead, she became immortal, not through monuments, but through curiosity, through scholarship, through art, through debate, through controversy, through memory. They destroyed her temples, but they could not destroy interest. They erased her name, but they could not erase questions. They buried her story, but they could not bury truth. Yet her modern fame creates a paradox. The more visible she becomes, the easier it is to forget her reality. The harder it is to hear her voice. Which brings us to the final chapters. Because beyond fame, beyond icons, beyond politics, beyond archaeology, there remains one question. Who is she as a person? Not a symbol, not a statue, not a projection, a human being. By the time we reach this point in Nefertiti's story, we know her as many things. A queen, a revolutionary, a pharaoh, a heretic, a survivor, an icon. But none of these titles answer the most difficult question. Who was Nefertiti as a human being? What did she think when no scribes were watching? What did she feel when ceremonies ended? What did she fear when power slipped? What did she hope when she looked at her daughters? History rarely preserves private lives, especially for women, especially for rulers, especially for those who were erased. So to find her, we must read between fragments, between broken inscriptions, between damaged reliefs, between unfinished statues, between silences. One of the few windows into her personal life comes from Amarna art. Unlike earlier Egyptian art, Amarna style is intimate. It shows emotion, movement, affection, vulnerability. We see her kissing her children, holding them on her lap, playing with them, touching foreheads with her husband, smiling, laughing, mourning. These scenes were public, but they were also sincere. They reveal a woman who valued family, who cherished closeness, who was emotionally expressive. This was unusual in royal imagery, and likely reflected reality. She gave birth to 6 daughters: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesepitan, Neferneferutin Tashret, Neferneferur, Setapenra. Raising royal children in a revolutionary court was dangerous. Disease, politics, succession, intrigue, loss. At least 2 of her daughters died young. Their tomb scenes show grief, real grief, not symbolic. Nefertiti is shown collapsed, supported, weeping. This was not propaganda. It was pain. These moments matter. They remind us that behind ideology was a mother. Behind authority was vulnerability. Behind ambition was attachment. Her partnership with Akhenaten was also deeply personal. Their relationship was unusually affectionate for royal standards. They touched, embraced, shared rituals, shared ideology, shared isolation. They were united against tradition, against priesthood, against conservatism. That creates bonds, strong ones, and dangerous ones. Together, they stood against an empire's past. That required trust, mutual dependence, emotional loyalty. When Akhenaten weakened, she did not abandon him. She took responsibility. She protected him. She preserved his vision, even when it became costly. That suggests devotion, not convenience. But devotion does not exclude ambition. Nefertiti was driven, strategic, calculated. She studied systems. She cultivated networks. She shaped narratives. She managed institutions. She did not stumble into power. She claimed it, consciously, deliberately. This combination is rare. Emotional intelligence and political intelligence, compassion and ruthlessness, attachment and independence. It suggests complexity, not caricature. What did she want? Evidence suggests three things: stability, legacy, meaning. Stability because she ruled during chaos, plagues, wars, religious upheaval, dynastic uncertainty. She tried to impose order through reform, through control, through ideology. Legacy because she understood memory. She built monuments, commissioned art, shaped theology, cultivated image. She wanted to be remembered, and she feared erasure. Ironically, she was right, meaning because Atenism was not just politics. It was spiritual. Akhenaten's hymns showed genuine belief. She supported them, participated, promoted them. She likely believed that she was serving cosmic purpose, not just ambition. Her religious devotion was not passive. She took active priestly roles. She sang hymns, performed rituals, mediated divine power. She did not pretend. She inhabited the role. Did she ever doubt? We cannot know, but signs suggest tension. Her later withdrawal, her reduced appearances, her defensive policies, her multiple identities. These indicate pressure, adaptation, survival, not certainty. She lived under constant scrutiny. As a woman, as a ruler, as a heretic, as a reformer. Every mistake magnified, every weakness exploited, every hesitation punished. That creates psychological strain. Modern rulers burn out. Ancient ones did too. Without therapy, without privacy, without escape. We should imagine her nights. In palaces, surrounded by guards, separated from ordinary life, carrying responsibility for millions, knowing enemies waited, knowing history watched, knowing failure meant erasure. And it did. Yet she continued. She did not flee. She did not surrender. She did not disappear voluntarily. She fought, administratively, ideologically, politically, symbolically, until she could not. Perhaps her greatest tragedy is that we know her face, but not her voice. No letters, no diaries, no personal prayers, no confessions, no private thoughts, only stone, only paint, only fragments. But fragments still speak. They tell us she was resilient, intelligent, emotionally rich, politically bold, spiritually committed, strategically adaptive. She was not a stereotype, not a seductress, not a puppet, not a victim, not a saint, not a villain. She was human, and that humanity makes her story powerful, because it reminds us that history is made by people, with fears, with hopes, with contradictions, with limits. By now, it is clear that what happened to Nefertiti was not an accident. It was not bad luck. It was not simple forgetfulness. It was not the result of missing records. It was a strategy, a familiar one, repeated across centuries, across cultures, across civilizations. When societies feel threatened by powerful women, they rarely confront that threat honestly. They erase it, they rewrite it, they minimize it, they distort it, they bury it, and then they pretend it never existed. Nefertiti's disappearance follows a recognizable pattern. First, her authority was questioned. Then, her legitimacy was undermined. Then, her memory was attacked. Then, her story was reassigned. Then, she was removed. This sequence appears again and again in history. Consider Hatshepsut. 2 centuries before Nefertiti, she ruled Egypt successfully for over 20 years. She expanded trade, built temples, stabilized the empire. After her death, her monuments were defaced. Her name was removed. Her images were destroyed. She was erased. Why? Because she proved women could rule. Consider Cleopatra VII, one of the most skilled political leaders of her age. Multilingual, strategic, diplomatic, economically competent. Yet history reduced her to a seductress, a temptress, a manipulator. Her intelligence was rewritten as sexuality, her leadership as scandal. Consider Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China as emperor. She reformed administration, expanded education, strengthened the state. After her death, historians portrayed her as cruel, immoral, unnatural. They attacked her character because they could not deny her success. Consider Elizabeth I. Though celebrated today, in her time, she was constantly attacked, called illegitimate, called weak, called unfeminine. Her authority was questioned daily. She survived through political genius, not acceptance. Different cultures, different centuries, same pattern. Power exercised by men is normal. Power exercised by women is suspicious. When men rule, failure is individual. When women rule, failure is blamed on gender. When men succeed, they are praised. When women succeed, they are reinterpreted. Nefertiti's case fits perfectly. She did not merely influence. She ruled. She commanded. She restructured religion. She reshaped ideology. She centralized authority. She governed. And she did it without disguising her femininity. That was intolerable. So the system reacted. It restored patriarchy. It restored priesthood. It restored male kingship. And it destroyed her memory. Even language reflects this bias. Ancient records often avoided feminine grammar when referring to rulers. Later historians assumed masculine identity. Modern scholars initially resisted female interpretations. Why? Because power was assumed to be male. Erasure is not always physical. Sometimes it is interpretive. Historians choose which sources matter, which theories are respectable, which narratives are serious. For decades, theories that Nefertiti ruled were dismissed as speculative. Male rulers with less evidence were accepted without question. That is not coincidence. Memory is political. Archives are political. Museums are political. Textbooks are political. They reflect values. They protect hierarchies. They reinforce norms. When Nefertiti was rediscovered, she was first rebranded as beauty. Because beauty is safe. Beauty is non-threatening. Beauty does not demand power. Calling her beautiful neutralized her. Only later did scholarship restore her authority. Slowly, reluctantly, against resistance. This pattern continues today. Women in leadership face disproportionate scrutiny. Their mistakes are amplified. Their motives questioned. Their appearance analyzed. Their emotions criticized. Their competence doubted. Progress exists, but the pattern persists. Nefertiti's story exposes this mechanism. It shows how societies protect power structures, not through force alone, but through memory management, through narrative control, through selective forgetting. Her erasure was not just about religion, not just about politics, not just about succession. It was about precedent. She set one, and precedents are dangerous. If one woman ruled successfully, others might try. If people remembered, they might question. If they questioned, they might change. So memory had to be controlled. Yet memory resisted. Fragments survived. Artifacts endured. Scholars persisted. Questions remained. Truth returned. This is why her story matters. Not just as ancient history, but as warning, as lesson, as mirror. Every generation rewrites the past. The question is, who gets erased and why? Nefertiti forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That history is curated. That power decides memory. That silence is manufactured. That absence is intentional. She also offers hope, because erasure is never complete. Truth leaves traces, in stone, in dust, in archives, in questions, in curiosity, and eventually, someone looks again. History is often written as if it were inevitable, as if events unfolded according to destiny, as if power always belonged where it ended up, as if those who vanished deserved to vanish. But the life of Nefertiti proves something different. It proves that history is fragile, that memory is contested, that truth is vulnerable, and that erasure is never complete. She was born into privilege, but not royalty. She rose through intelligence, through education, through partnership, through courage, through ambition. She did not inherit absolute power. She built it. She entered the palace as a young bride. She left it as a ruler. Between those two moments lies one of the most extraordinary transformations in human history. From consort to co-regent, to sovereign, to erased figure, to global icon. No other ancient woman followed that path so completely. She helped overthrow a religious system that had lasted thousands of years. She dismantled a priesthood that rivaled kings. She replaced hundreds of gods with one. She centralized divine authority. She reshaped art. She reshaped politics. She reshaped ideology. She reshaped memory. She ruled during crisis, during fragmentation, during uncertainty, during resistance, during transition. She governed without precedent, without institutional support, without acceptance, without security. And yet, she governed. Her enemies destroyed her monuments, chiseled out her name, dismantled her temples, buried her records, rewrote her story, pretended she never existed. They believed that without memory, she would die. Twice. They were wrong. 3,000 years later, her face still looks at us. Not as propaganda, not as ideology, not as myth, but as presence, as evidence, as testimony, as resistance. When we look at her bust, we are not seeing beauty alone. We are seeing defiance. We are seeing intelligence. We are seeing endurance. We are seeing history refusing to be controlled. She survived not because she was perfect, not because she always succeeded, not because she never failed. She survived because she mattered, because she changed things, because she disrupted systems, because she left traces. Her story forces us to ask difficult questions. Who controls history? Who decides whose lives are remembered? Whose achievements are celebrated? Whose failures are forgiven? Whose existence is denied? It reminds us that power is not only exercised in palaces and battlefields. It is exercised in archives, in textbooks, in museums, in media, in memory. Nefertiti lost her throne. She lost her dynasty. She lost her monuments. She lost her burial place. She lost her official legacy. But she did not lose significance. Instead, she gained something more enduring: relevance. She speaks to every generation that has been told, "You do not belong here. This role is not for you. This power is not yours. This history is not yours." And she answers, "It is." She reminds us that systems are constructed, that traditions are maintained by choice, that hierarchies are defended by narrative, that exclusion is justified by myth, and that all of these can be challenged. Her life shows that one person, with vision, with discipline, with courage, with intelligence, can disrupt centuries, even if the disruption is later buried. Because buried truths return. They always do. Today, archaeologists still search for her tomb. Scholars still debate her reign. Museums still argue over her image. Students still study her life. Artists still reinterpret her. Viewers still listen to her story. She is not finished. Perhaps one day her burial will be found. Perhaps her mummy will be identified. Perhaps new inscriptions will surface. Perhaps new evidence will emerge. Perhaps we will hear more of her voice. But even if that never happens, we already know enough. We know she ruled. We know she mattered. We know she was feared. We know she was erased. We know she returned. And that is her final victory. The men who try to destroy her memory are forgotten. Their names survive only in footnotes. Their motives are barely remembered. Their power ended. Hers did not. She remains. In stone, in scholarship, in questions, in curiosity, in imagination, in possibility. Nefertiti was the beautiful one who has come, but she became something more, the powerful one who stayed. Her story is not just about ancient Egypt. It is about every voice silenced, every truth buried, every history rewritten, every woman underestimated, every legacy attacked, and every return. Because when we remember her, when we tell her story, when we refuse to accept erasure, we do more than honor the past. We defend the future. This is why Nefertiti matters. This is why she will always matter. This is why she could not be erased. She ruled. She fell. She was forgotten. She returned. And she remains. Forever.